and slide decks will be available on the Alaska Energy Authority website after the fact. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Erin Whitney, Director of the DOE's Arctic Energy Office.
Thank you, Jeremy. Welcome everyone to the symposium today on RPSs and clean energy standards. I am with the Arctic Energy Office at the Department of Energy. We're the only regional office in the Department of Energy ecosystem. And it is my pleasure today to host Jenny Sumner from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to speak to us about renewable portfolio standards, RPSs, and clean energy standards, CESs, across the United States and some of the trends that have been seen. I think what I'd like to do is have Jenny give her presentation, and then I would like to moderate a discussion afterwards with some questions that are relevant to Alaska and the conversations that have been had in the last year or two about RPSs and CESs. So I think I will hand it over now to Jenny and to take it from there.
Great, thanks, Erin. I'll go ahead and get my slides up, so just give me a minute here. All right, can everybody see the deck and the view it's supposed to be in? Correct. Well, yeah, thanks again for having me. I'm Jenny Sumner. I manage the modeling and analysis group at NREL. My background is in renewable energy policy, so I've spent a lot of years at NREL looking at state RPSs and more recently at CESs from a policy perspective, tracking some of the evolution of these policies over time, working closely with colleagues at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab who compile some of the information that I'm going to show here as well. I'll run through some slides. Yeah, it sounds like then we'll have some Q&A time. Happy to answer questions as we see fit. So first wanted to just do an overview of what are these policy types, some of the distinctions between them, and then after that, we'll talk about how these policies look across the country and how they have been changing over time and some of those key components. And a lot of this work is based on a best practices document that I wrote with a couple of colleagues a few years ago. It was focused on an international audience. At the time, there were a lot of countries starting to think about renewable portfolio standards. So that site at the bottom is talking about international best practices, but really drawn from lessons learned in the United States. So put that there as a reference for everybody. But to make sure we're on the same page, renewable portfolio standard is a public policy tool, requires a certain amount of renewable electricity relative to the entire electricity supply. We do distinguish RPSs from renewable goals in that RPSs have some type of enforcement mechanism, whether that's a penalty for non-performance on a megawatt hour or some other type of compliance mechanism through the Public Utilities Commission or other regulatory agency. We know, and you guys probably all know, that all of these policies are unique. So they're typically done at the state level, and every state has different motivations for why they would want to have an RPS, have different thoughts on target types, whether that's a megawatt hour target or megawatt target. Different technology approaches exist. So every RPS that we talk about is going to look different. So we'll try to think about some common themes and common characteristics of them through the presentation today. RPSs can be framed in a variety of ways. What we have seen lately is that most of them are framed as a share of energy demand, so like 20% or some other percentage target. But we have seen in the US and even internationally some targets that are based on a gigawatt or gigawatt hour perspective, and we can talk about that as well for different reasons to structure targets in different ways. Some of the key design elements that do vary and look different across different states. include setting the target. So the level of target we'll talk about a little bit later can always be different, as well as the interim schedule. So typically RPSs are developed with a phase-in approach, so setting percentages by specific years over time. The list of eligible resources can vary with renewable portfolio standards. Typically, all types of solar and wind are eligible across different state policies, but states do vary on how they consider biomass, as well as how they consider hydropower, and in particular, larger hydropower that may be previously installed, types of things like that. Another key characteristic is thinking about imports and exports. So I don't know the Alaska context quite well enough to speak to this for you all, but in other states that are part of regional power markets, they tend to allow any imports from that power market to be eligible. Some of that is due to just regulatory considerations and inability to distinguish between where the power is coming from, or inability to put in place policies that may be disrupting interstate commerce and some of those considerations. And then lastly, thinking about what is the compliance and enforcement structure. So with energy policies, the Public Utilities Commission or equivalent is usually the one tasked with approving plans from the utility, verifying that the utility is complying, having some sort of cycle for that verification process, typically on an annual basis to verify compliance, and then making sure, if the utility is engaging in IRPs, that the RPS is accounted for as part of that process as well. Penalties for non-compliance look different across different states, but the most common is a megawatt hour dollar amount. So that can be determined based on, what is a reasonable amount to assume that utilities could comply for, and if they go don't comply, that funding is paid as a penalty. States can also think about what is that money used for. I would say it's pretty common for states to want to redirect it into some type of renewable energy development. And that can be done in different ways, but yeah, there can be an interest in making sure that that money is used for some other type of renewable projects, or facilitating something else that will help achieve the RPS. So those are RPS kind of basic characteristics. This newer flavor of policies is a clean electricity standard or clean energy standard. This policy has evolved, I would say, from RPSs, but includes a broader set of eligible resources. So thinking about technologies like nuclear or even large-scale hydro that might be excluded from a renewable portfolio standard, but are considered eligible under a CES. We've seen these policies evolve, I would say, in the last 3 or 4 years as states have been thinking about meeting 100% targets. And as they have thought about, what does it mean to have 100% clean energy? They want to be able typically to utilize existing clean energy resources that are available and will likely be operating into the next decade or two as part of that clean energy standard. One key piece that we have seen in a lot of CESs is that a lot of states have not yet defined the implementation or enforcement mechanism for their CES policy. So that's something to pay particular attention to. Some of that, I think, is because CESs are largely long-term targets at the moment that are layered on top of shorter-term renewable portfolio standards. So it could be that states are really focused on their RPS and meeting those interim targets and final targets for their RPS, and at some point we'll turn to the CES and figure out how to transition to that policy framework. So a little bit more detail on RPSs and CESs in terms of what we've seen across the states. This is drawn from work by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. They have a great annual summary of state policies. I'm going to encourage folks to look at for more detail. But this figure on the right, I really like because it shows a couple things. So the year of the maximum target, you can see there's a lot of clustering around certain types of N years. There's also some clustering around the max target level. So the policies in blue are RPS targets. These were passed typically, 10 to 20 years ago. And so we've seen end year targets in the 2020 to 2030 timeframe. And then our yellow targets, our clean energy standard targets, we see later off into the future. So some clustering more around the 2040 and really around the 2050 timeframe. You can also see that there is, sort of this transition into higher level of targets, longer timeframes, and layering of policies. So it's not to say that you couldn't pass a CES without an RPS, but that's just the evolution that we have seen as states have transitioned to some different policy frameworks for that longer term target. When we look across the country, this map shows the nominal RPS targets, and the kind of caveat here is that you may see, a policy pass that says, we're going to be at 50% by 2030, but that target may only apply to certain utilities in the state service territory. So the data here accounts for that, any deductions basically for entities that might not be subject to the RPS. But what you can see, and if you looked at this over time, you would see that states are passing more aggressive RPS targets. I think 5 or 6 years ago, we had, a handful of states pop up that were in the, 50 to 100% range. Now there are considerably more states thinking in that range as a feasible target for them in the 2030, 2040 timeframe. We also see a number of states that are at 25% or don't have a target. Some of those states have used different mechanisms to encourage renewable deployment. I won't talk a lot about that today, but you can also think of a state like Texas, where there has been a lot of wind and solar developed because it is a least cost resource, and they have established market mechanisms to allow those wind and solar resources to grow and be compensated for. When we take the map of RPSs at the state level and then layer over it in green state CESs, we see a couple things. One is that most CESs are passed in combination with an RPS. So where you see that hatching of blue and green, there is this intention by a lot of states with an RPS to add on a CES. There are a couple exceptions to that. I'm thinking about states like Nebraska with 100% CES with no renewable portfolio standard adopted. And then you do see a number of RPS states that have not adopted a CES. Last piece I wanted to talk about just from an overview perspective is thinking about other types of carve-outs or provisions that might direct development towards certain types of resources. The most common approach has been to think about a solar carve-out or multiplier. Sometimes this is framed as a distributed generation carve-out or multiplier that's maybe not necessarily focused on solar, but some other types of distributed resources. This was a very common approach as states were starting to develop their RPSs and continues today, really focused on trying to make sure that some of the portfolio of renewable resources is sited at the distribution level, and providing sort of a different set of benefits than renewables might be at the transmission level. So different types of policy approaches here with a carve out, which requires like a certain percentage of the RPS to be met by solar or distributed generation. The multiplier approach looks at basically saying if you had 1 megawatt of rooftop PV, that would be essentially worth 2 or 3 or 4 megawatt hours, depending on how the policy is structured for purposes of compliance with the RPS. So a couple different approaches, but basically ways to think about, how could different resource mixes be incorporated into what the utility uses to comply. Last thing I wanted to add is just there are a lot of resources available on RPSs and CESs. I've presented some stuff from LBNL here today. They have a great page here that provides an annual snapshot of market trends, a slide deck of that. They also have a great spreadsheet that looks at, when you take all these policies and try to figure out how many megawatt hours by year each state would need to comply with its policy. Nice data resource there. We also work at NREL with the Clean Energy States Alliance. They have a project called the 100% Clean Energy Collaborative. This is a group of states that either have a clean energy standard, even if it's not at 100%, or just may be interested in understanding more about the policy. They do a series of webinars. They held an annual summit earlier this year. And they also produce some resources, have a great depository of state policy language and some compliance documents and things like that that can be helpful to folks if you want to just see what other states are doing, how they have incorporated certain policy components or things like that. So great resources to be aware of, and it sounds like this deck is being shared and made available. So please check out the resources, and I'll have my contact information here as well for any additional questions. But with that, I'll close out my presentation and turn it over to you, Erin.
Thanks, Jenny. And if you can just stay on, I think this is where we can have a great dialogue and hopefully learn from some of your experience surveying these RPSs and CESs across the country. It's fascinating to see what some of the other states have done. The first question I'd like to ask actually builds on a question that was asked during your talk by one of the attendees, and it relates to the conversation that we've seen in the state about the recovery of fines and how they are generally recovered by utilities. And one of the questions from the attendees that relates to this is, are penalties applied have you seen penalties applied to investor-owned utilities and co-ops? Because investor-owned utility penalties would come from shareholders and co-op penalties would come from the ratepayer. So, I think a big focus of some of the debate in our state is, okay, if we levy penalties on utilities, is that reflected in rates? Does it come from something else? What have you seen in your experience surveying these types of maneuvers?
Yep. Yeah. So states typically, when they are passing an RPS policy, only focus on the investor-owned utility, and that's largely because that's what they have authority over. But we do see some co-ops who adopt their own RPS or some sort of equivalent policy. So how that works for an IOU from that perspective is that, the penalty would be paid by shareholders, and the state policy or the regulator then would decide what to do with that funding. So we were talking about earlier. For co-op penalties, that would be coming from the ratepayers or the owners of the co-op. Same for municipal electric utilities. And they would be tasked with figuring out what to do with that funding. There is a little bit of work on I believe, what yeah, like what kind of restrictions happen for IOUs on their penalties. I believe, yeah, there's some stuff in the weeds there around like how can they make sure that that's being paid by shareholders and not going into rates and structures like that. So yeah, you can think through and prescribe in your policy basically, you know, how funding is handled for non-compliance.
Thank you. Do you know if when you've seen penalties reflected in rates, are there restrictions on how much rates can be affected by penalties, or have you seen firsthand how much rates could be affected by penalties if targets weren't met?
Yeah, I don't know offhand. My sense is that most penalties are paid by shareholders, if not all. But it's not something I have my pulse on immediately on the top of my head. There have also been very few utilities that have not been compliant, so there's not a ton of experience knowing, you know, how that will come into practice. And I see there's, yeah, kind of a follow-up question on states that have not met targets. So yeah, most states and most utilities have been on track. There have been a few exceptions I can think of. One in particular is in Washington, D.C. They have a solar carve-out that the utilities have struggled to meet, and they have decided to use the penalties for non-compliance to fund other solar programs in the district. So for example, there's been a big focus on developing community solar programs in the district, or other ways to basically support solar development that's more more feasible or realistic given some of the siting constraints in the district or things like that. Yeah, so it's a yeah, example of how you can basically use fees that are paid to direct to other types of renewable energy projects or production.
That's actually a great segue into another hot topic of conversation here, is how penalty payment proceeds or non-compliance fees are generally directed. And in your example that you brought up for Washington, D.C., and you mentioned that there's been this move to direct those penalties to support other solar programs. Were those penalties paid to some centralized entity that was supporting those solar programs, or were those penalty payments going back for the utilities to spend on solar programs? Does that make sense what the question is?
Yeah, like who are the stakeholders involved? I
Or
believe,
yeah, who gets the penalty payments?
yeah, so I believe they're usually handled through the regulator, and in DC, yeah, it's handled at the district level. Somehow that gets passed through to the program efforts, and I don't know exactly how that pass through happens, but it's not passed through back to the utility. In that case, it's passed to programs run or supported by the district that are focused on solar deployment. So that could look different in different states depending on how, yeah, what organizations are involved with developing renewable energy projects. But yeah, I'm not aware of any, you know, dollars that basically circle back to the utility to run programs. It could be different too in DC, which is a restructured market. So in that state or that district, you know, utilities are not owning their own generation to begin with.
Okay. And have the penalties actually been paid in the Washington, D.C. scenario, such that there is money going into those solar projects?
Yeah.
Do you know how much has been collected just offhand?
Don't
Or
know, but I think
ballpark?
it's in
Okay.
the LBNL data actually. I want to say it's in the millions. Like it was enough to support really strategic programming by the district.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't know the number offhand. I think could get that to you, or yeah, check out the LBNL stuff, or yeah, the district does its own kind of RPS summary compliance report as well.
Okay, great. And following up on the discussion about penalty payments, and this also comes from Mr. Izzo, there's a question about whether there's a list or a chart that shows rate impacts for states that have adopted RPSs or CESs. Is that in any of those links that you posted?
Yeah, I would check out the LBNL stuff. There is an annual report that has looked at rate impacts, but I would caveat it and say it typically looks at just what is if there is like a line item on bills that directs, you know, ratepayer dollars to an RPS fund, it will look at quantifying those dollars. It does not look at any sort of trade-off questions of, you know, the utilities buying more renewables but less natural gas or less of something else. So it's not really a comprehensive rate impact study, but it does attempt to quantify, you know, here are line items for renewable energy costs. Just slightly different question.
Okay, thank you. I want to also switch to talking about RPSs in combination with clean energy standards. It's interesting to me that a lot of states may have started with RPSs and moved to CESs. And you mentioned Nebraska went directly to a clean energy standard without having an RPS first. Do you know why that was the case for Nebraska and what the pros and cons of such an approach might be?
I don't know, to be honest. Yeah, I'm not sure how they landed there. A lot of times, yeah, state policy stuff can emerge in a lot of interesting ways just based on, you know, where stakeholders are at, where development of renewables in the state is at already. Yeah, so I don't have specific context on Nebraska, but yeah, it is a bit of an outlier in that perspective of kind of coming in a little bit later into the policy landscape and yeah, deciding to yeah, I think some of the questions on, you know, CES versus RPS are in the target setting, and some states may find it more appealing to set a higher quantitative target, whether it's an RPS or CES, and then figure out, you know, what is our resource mix to get us there. So that can be something that happens as part of those discussions.
Okay. And then also with regard to an RPS versus or in combination with a CES, do you see differences in the language? So typically we think of an RPS as percentage of renewables or percentage of, you know, power supplied. And do you see differences in language, say with a CES, you know, is it decarbonization amounts? Is it, or do you typically see the same sort of metrics for the goals? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yeah, typically I think we see, so in renewable portfolio standards, yeah, a target of, you know, percentage of retail sales is pretty common, and then the state will define the renewable resources that are eligible. I'd say you see a similar structure on the CES side, so saying, here's our percentage of retail sales that we want to meet, and then how do we define clean in that policy construct? And that deals with different technology types. And typically either the state policy will call that out of, you know, here's our list of 10 technologies that are eligible, or in some cases they will pass that on to the regulator to work through in a rulemaking of, you know, here, what is that list of eligible resources? Also, if there is a renew or a resource outside of that list that wants to be eligible or feels like they should be eligible, setting up a process for them to petition the regulator for inclusion, or at least, you know, verifying inclusion or exclusion from the policy can be really helpful.
Okay, so I'm understanding that the CES maybe just broadens the array of technologies that may be eligible and defines the word clean. You mentioned that some CESs, you know, include nuclear or large-scale hydropower. Have you seen carbon capture incorporated into any CESs? That's certainly been a conversation topic here.
Yeah, I have not screened for that personally. I know early on in RPS days, there were a few states that had included carbon capture or other technologies similar to that. They did not tend to be used at the time, just because I think the technology wasn't there yet, wasn't cost competitive, but that could be something that changes with new, you know, federal investments in CCS or just other, yeah, emerging trends in that space. So I don't know offhand, yeah, how other states treat that under their clean energy standard or electricity standard. Yeah, I'd be happy to provide more information on that later. Yeah, check in with a few folks.
Okay. And then another topic that's come up, you know, in discussing an RPS or a clean energy standard here in Alaska is the role of net metering. And I'm wondering if there are any nuances with regard to net metering that you've seen in RPSs or CESs with regard to whether it's annual, whether there's been limits placed on it, maybe in terms of the amount of credit that's given. Are there any details there that you can tease out of what you've seen?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, under RPS policies where there's the most experience, you know, pairing those with complementary policies like net metering. The intersection you see is on those solar carve-outs or distributed generation carve-outs, and wanting to make sure that you're not inadvertently making sure those requirements can't be met. So for example, if the, you know, utility has to have 5% of their generation from distributed generation and the net metering policy is capped at 2%, you're gonna run into some challenges there or need other pathways to fulfill that remaining gap. So thinking about like what are those intersections is really important. It's also important to think about the compliance mechanism, and this has happened in most states. For their RPSs, they will use a REC, a renewable energy certificate, as a way to track compliance. Some state net metering policies may be vague on who owns the RECs from those distributed generation systems. So thinking through, you know, what is the pathway to ensure compliance, and also make sure that, you know, if net metered systems convey the RECs to the customer, then the utility needs some way to purchase them or some other pathway to getting distributed generation into their system that they can take credit for. So those are some of the issues we tend to see with complementary policies, making sure one is not inhibiting the other, and that they are working together to achieve a common goal is really important to think about.
Okay, great. I'm going to switch over to some questions that I've seen in the question and answer, and I want to go to Mr. Mason's question about the Senate bill that's being considered in the Alaska legislature, which includes a provision that exempts utilities from their first RPS noncompliance fine, and the bill also allows utilities to satisfy fines by paying a customer to install a distributed energy systems or energy efficiency project. So the question is, do other states with RPSs allow the fines to be satisfied in that way?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure what that means to be exempt from their first RPS non-compliance fine. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that language in other states, but the pieces on, yeah, having the utilities satisfy fines by paying a customer to install DG or EE, that's similar to like the DC example. So like having a way for basically the fines or the equivalent dollar amount of the fines to be used to install systems. I think that is standard in some other state RPSs. Yeah, do other states allow fines to be satisfied in that way? Yeah, I would say that that second piece is definitely happening in other states. The first piece I'm not sure about. I don't recall any examples off the top of my head though.
Okay, great. And then another question here is there such a thing as an affordable energy portfolio standard? Or phrased another way, how do states structure affordability targets? And that is a big concern of ours up here because we pay, on the whole, a bit more than most other folks in the United States.
Yeah, yeah, the concept of an affordable energy portfolio standard is not one that I'm familiar with. I think that would be maybe a new construct or a new policy design. But within the RPS and CES frameworks, there are a variety of ways to cap costs, and that definitely has been of interest to states. That can happen through the alternative compliance payment or the compliance mechanism. So basically saying, if there aren't resources available below this amount, your costs are capped. So that's one way to think about it. Some other states do look at caps on like what is the impact on customer rates and setting a cap there. So that's another way to look at it. Some other states don't, I think, have specific targets, but make some more general thoughts on the regulator has some authority, like if costs are impacting rates above a certain amount, they can basically tweak the policy or think about extending years or just have some flexibility there. So that is, yeah, there's definitely ways to think about, making sure that the policy has some certainty or some caps to it in terms of cost impacts. Yeah, and that also varies by state, and I think varies by just how what their current rates are, what their rate escalation might look like without renewable resources, some of those considerations.
Okay. Another follow-up question to the penalty payments, and I should have asked this sooner, but I didn't see it. So apologies, Kate, for missing your question. How many states direct ratepayers' money? Actually, this is probably not penalty, but how many states direct ratepayers' money toward a fund to help achieve an RPS or have a line item on member bills for an RPS fund? So I apologize, that's not about penalty funds. That's, I think, just something that might be incorporated into a rate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it can be done. So I'm in Excel territory in Colorado here, and we have a line item on the bill. It's about 2% that goes to support renewable development for the RPS in particular. And so those funds are tracked separately and accounted for separately than other ratepayer dollars to the utility. I'm not sure, the distribution of states that break it out on a line item on their bills versus just having it be part of the customer's overall bill. It may depend on just some of the regulatory considerations there. But it's my guess is it would be similar to how the utility handles other programmatic line items. So some utilities will have, a line item for demand side management programs or for supporting low income energy assistance programs. So stuff like that sometimes gets broken out on the bill. Sometimes I think it doesn't.
And do
Yeah.
those apply to all customers, or are they opt in, opt out? For example, the line item on your Excel bills.
Yeah, that would apply to all customers. I think there are a few states in their RPSs that exempt very large customers, like large industrial customers, or they may require that industrial customer to be compliant on their own towards the RPS and not through the utility. But yeah, in general, it would apply to the utility's general rate base.
Okay. There's another question here. Are there any examples of isolated grids, like in Alaska, for example, in Arctic or subarctic climates, with seismic activity and extended periods of darkness that have successful RPSs or CESs?
Yeah, can think of islanded grids. So yeah, maybe our examples in the US are not, we don't have a case exactly like Alaska, but Hawaii definitely has a lot of strong renewable energy targets. They don't have the extended periods of darkness, but do have isolated islanded grids from that perspective. When we think outside of the US, yeah, other regions that might be similar might be like Northern Europe, where there have been policies to ensure renewable development. Yeah, I'm sure there are better examples, but those are the ones that come to mind. And I guess related to the extended periods of darkness, I would say most RPSs look at compliance on an annual level. So thinking about, yeah, there may be months where the resource mix is more fossil and less renewables, and other months where it's more renewables and less fossil. But looking at that at an annual level to be able to account for some of those just variations that will happen month to month or day to day even.
Okay. Thank you. I have one final question, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy, who I know has some questions as well. What do you typically see, or what is the range of end targets that you might see in RPSs and clean energy standards? Obviously, you see some that go up to 100%, but do you see some that maybe only go up to 50%, or some intermediate number?
Yeah, RPSs, when they first started becoming more prevalent, tended to be in the, I would say, like 15 to 25%. And this was back in, the 2010s timeframe, and utilities, didn't have a lot of experience integrating renewables, weren't really sure what the cost would look like going forward. I would say, yeah, many of those states then subsequently bumped up their targets. So now we see targets more commonly, I would say, in the 25 to 50% range. And then there's a entire category that's more the 80% or 100% clean energy standard. That's more, I would say, policies that have been passed in the last 5 years or so, and have end year targets that are, a decade or two away at least.
Okay, great, thank you. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy for some of his questions. Thank you so much, Jenny.
Thanks,
Yep,
thanks, Erin, and thanks, Jenny. Yeah, you get to be on the hot seat today, so I appreciate your willingness to take all these questions. I'm going to ask you a couple questions pretty specific to Alaska, although I think there's, might be some other analogous places. But are there any examples of RPS or CES programs that include heating? That's obviously a big concern and question for us.
Yeah, not those policies themselves, but there have been a suite of policies called clean heat standards that basically do have a similar purpose on the heating side. Um, yeah, there are some folks who have been tracking that. I would say clean heat standards or clean heat policies tend to look at, what are so similar. What are the types of resources that could be used and how would they be defined? I would say there's also within those policies more focus on efficiency or just how can you account for, installing more efficient equipment than you see on the RPS side. But yeah, I would say they tend to be separate policies, but there is, stuff in that space for sure.
Great. So something for the task force to consider might be to actually look at the clean heating standards as well, since heating loads are such an important part of our energy mix. Another pretty specific Alaska question. Are there other states, or how do other states handle underserved or remote areas? Are there some other examples that we can look to there where there's might be some lessons learned?
And you're thinking about like how do you make sure those underserved areas are seeing renewable deployment in their area, or
Well, I guess you can probably take this either way. So make sure they benefit, but also make sure they're not impacted by higher rates.
mhm. Um, yeah, I think the conversation earlier around just capping rates generally for customers. You could think about if you have a class of low income customers who might be qualifying for other energy assistance programs. You could think about exempting those populations or that rate class from increases in rates due to renewable projects or any other type of projects that are installed by the utility. There are also a lot of programs in states focused on solar deployment and providing additional incentives for solar to be deployed on low income households, and maybe providing a bonus incentive or something that makes sure that it's not just wealthy homeowners that are able to adopt rooftop PV, but providing other pathways for low income customers. That can also include community solar and making sure there are projects available for renters or for people who may not, for a variety of reasons, be able to put solar on their homes. So that's another avenue that's been, say, pretty common for states to look at in the DG rooftop space.
Okay, and then I've got one last question. Are there any states or other countries that are making meaningful progress on progression towards decarbonization or renewable adaptation that do not have a CES or an RPS?
Yeah, I think the example that comes to mind in the US is Texas. So Texas had an RPS early on to kind of, I would say, more like kickstart the industry. They never, extended their RPS or increased the target. So utilities have continued to develop renewable resources there. They tend to be the least cost resources to develop in the state. So it's things like very large wind farms, very large solar farms. They're starting to see storage development there as well. So there certainly are states that have taken that pathway. There's some good data by EIA to just look at, the percentage of renewables generated in each state. Yeah, without knowing the list off the top of my head, Texas and maybe Oklahoma and Nebraska come to mind as states who have developed a lot of renewable resources and developed policy and regulatory frameworks to do that without an RPS or without an active RPS in place.
I follow up there. I'm guessing that if they're doing it without the RPS, there's got to be an economic reason, right? So Oklahoma, my guess is that they're basically exporting a lot of that wind. Texas, maybe not. Is that
Yeah,
part of the equation?
I don't know how much Oklahoma is exporting. Texas, I think, uses the bulk inside Texas since they are their own sort of mini grid within ERCOT. So I believe most of that stays within Texas. They do still have a lot of need for transmission development. So a lot of the renewables are in the sort of northwest pockets of the state, and there's a transmission that will go down to the load centers. Or in the southwest or central regions. But yeah, the resource quality is really high in Texas. They also have a competitive wholesale market, so that's the mechanism that generators can use to be compensated for their generation. And yeah, the amount of solar and wind and storage going in has been pretty dramatic there.
Okay, well, great. Thank you. I think we'll stop grilling you here. And I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. So with that, I'll say thank you to Jenny as well as Aaron for conducting the grilling. And with that, we'll conclude our agenda for the day. As a reminder, the slide deck and the recording of this will be posted to AEA's Alaska Energy Security Task Force. You can tell this is the last one. Our agenda got shorter, my script got shorter, and I think we're all kind of ready for this to be done, although I enjoyed it. So this concludes the Energy Symposium series hosted by ASEP in support of the Energy Security Task Force. We hope you found this informative. You can find all the previous recordings and presentation slide decks on the Alaska Energy Authority website for the task force. And thank you for joining us this week.
Thank you.